Welcome to the Intro to Android. Just want to welcome you here. Just want to let you know, my name's Kevin Moore. I actually grew up in Fresno, went to school here and everything. I now live in the Bay Area. So I've been an Android developer for over 9 years. I have 2 video courses on LinkedIn Learning and one for raywinderlich.com. So I've been doing Android for a while. Really enjoy it. Started out doing Java, which is what the language was then. Now it's Kotlin, so that's the newest, hottest language. It's equivalent to Swift if you're familiar with iOS development, but it's a very nice language. Also, I'm a tech editor for 2 Kotlin books, Android Apprentice and Kotlin Coroutines by Tutorials. And I'm also the organizer for the GDG Sonoma, which is above San Francisco. So that's where I'm from now. So I also have done some tutorials for Ray Winderlich. So let's talk about Android, what it is, and kind of give you an intro. So if you're interested in programming on Android, this will give you kind of an introductory idea of what it's like and what makes up Android. So Android itself is a mobile operating system. It was developed by Google. It's an open source operating system, so anyone can use it. It's really nice that they do that. It's not like the walled garden of the other operating system. It's built on the Linux kernel. And it uses Java, Kotlin, and C languages. C languages are for the lower level stuff. You don't have to do that. But if you want to connect to a specific camera, you can write your own C code to get in there. But now Kotlin is considered the primary language. Google has endorsed it. And Kotlin was developed by JetBrains, which is a developer of integrated development environments. So it's a really nice language, very easy to use. And Android uses either the ART or the Dalvik virtual machine. I believe Dalvik's the older one, ART's a newer one. Basically what it is, it's a virtual machine that runs your app. So each app has its own little virtual machine that it runs on. So if your app crashes, it doesn't affect the rest of the system. And then for databases, there's a built-in SQLite database, and that's a very light version of SQL. And it makes it really easy to store your data. And then there's Android Studio is the development environment for Android, and it's free. Anyone can use it. You can download it. There's other tools, Visual Studio you could use. You could use different ones, IntelliJ, so forth, but it's really nice environment for Android. So let's go ahead and talk about the architecture. For an Android app, it has several different components. The very first one is called the application. This is something you don't have to write, but there is one application per activity. And then there's activities, and you can think of activities as your screens. And we'll go into detail about that a little bit more. Then there's fragments, and then services. Services are background tasks. Now there's different, I don't know if any of you have heard of these architectural patterns, but I just want to quickly talk about them. There's something called the model view controller. Basically your models where you store your data. So this is going to be a class that has, say if you have a user model, it's going to have your username, your social security number, things like that. That's where you're going to store your data. Your view is what the user's going to see. So if they're going to see a screen with all your user information, that's going to be your view. And then your controller is like your logic. So that's going to be telling the view what to display, and when they hit the save button, it'll go off and do the saving, so forth. Some newer ones are the model view presenter. It's kind of the same thing, just different names. Your presenter is where all your logic is. And then the newer one is called the model view model. So Google has created some newer classes that are actually view models that you can use to do your programming. So let's go ahead and talk about the application class. Again, I said that there's only one application class for your whole application. And it's created the first thing in your application. And it's a place to initialize app-wide resources. So you could initialize your database, you could initialize logging, and so forth. So it's a real nice place for that. And it needs to be defined in your manifest. And we'll talk about the manifest a little bit later in more detail. So let's talk about activities. This is your UI entry point. So when you start a screen, you're going to have a starting activity. And this is what's going to show when your app starts. So in Android, they use XML for their layouts. XML is a little bit older format, but it's pretty useful for creating layouts. You can use one activity per screen. That's definitely one way of doing it. So every time, so if you have your user, you go to maybe a payment screen, each one of those is going to be a different activity. That's one way to do it. Some of the newer ways of doing it is just to have one activity, and then you can swap screens in and out of that. It's just a different way of handling it. There's also fragments. Fragments are like mini activities, and you can have multiple fragments per activity. And this is a typical activity life cycle. You have methods like onCreate. That's where your activity gets started. That's where you set your layout. Then there's the startup phases like onStart, onResume, and these are like different things that you can do. So like if someone goes to the background or goes to a different app, you can maybe save data when they do that. So you're notified in these different events. And of course, when your activity is gone, the onDestroy is called, and you can save everything and do whatever you need to do when you're finished. And again, if you guys have any questions, stop me, interrupt me, ask questions if you have anything you want to ask. Now, fragments, again, like I mentioned, are like mini activities. You can have, it has a similar life cycle to an activity. You can have multiple fragments per activity. And this is kind of useful for things like tablets. You could have, like if you look at Gmail, you may have one fragment that's your list of emails, and then on your right's the actual email. So that might be two different fragments. You use the fragment manager to add a fragment to your screen, and then you use a fragment transaction to do that. However, fragments are a bit more complicated. I personally don't like them. I know that there's been some issues with the older fragments. So if you're going to use them, you want to use the fragment library because that has some updated code there. This is a sample code for a fragment. This is like a search fragment. Again, just like the activity, we have the onCreate and onDestroy. But the newer methods that you have that you don't have an activity is your onCreate view. And that's where you say, lay out this screen using the layout in Flare. Here we have a search layout. And then once it's created, you'll get the onView created, and you can set your data in there. And I know there's a lot to hear, so this is a real kind of brief overview of how all this works. There's definitely a lot of resources online where you can get more details about this. Services are things that run in the background. So one of the things I wrote as my first application was a podcast app. Obviously, when you're playing music, playing podcasts, that has to run on the background. So you'd use a service for that. So as you're going off to different applications, you turn your screen off, you can have your podcast or your music continue to play. So that's where you'd run a service. So there's no UI associated with it. And there's several different types. There's a foreground service that can be played all the time, running. And then there's a background service that if your application is running out of memory, the system might shut it down. So this is an example of the service. You notice that it's kind of similar to an activity in that you have the onCreate and onDestroy. One different method is the onStart command. So when the activity starts the service, it will get called here, and you can send it messages saying, hey, start the podcast or skip to the next track, things like that. So let's talk about the UI. Again, we mentioned that it was defined in XML. You can use the Android Studio Designer, which is a really nice GUI layout where you can drag and drop different elements. You can add text views and different things like that. And there's different types of widgets. So there's two types. There's view groups, and those are your containers. And then there's views, which are the actual items. Now here's some XML code, which is a little verbose here, but it just shows you kind of what it would look like if you were going to edit the XML by itself. This is the newer constraint layout. It's a really nice, we'll go into this a little bit more detail, but it's a real nice layout tool for that. And then our text views for displaying text. So for view groups, again, these are containers that hold the views, and we're going to have some basic types. The very first one that was one of the first ones that Google developed is called the linear layout. And that's designed to lay out things either vertically or horizontally. And so they're just one item after another. And so it's a very simple layout. Then the next one is the relative layout. And this is where you can have items that are set relative to other ones. So you can say, I want this text view to be aligned to the left of another text view. Scroll views are for if you want to have one element that you want that's going to be really long, you can have it scrolled in a scroll view. And then constraint layouts is the newer version of the relative layout. It's a nicer one, and Google's made it so it's very fast and performant. And then the recycler view is where you're going to show lists of items. So that's where you're going to have, it has built-in scrolling and allows you to show different rows of items on there. For views, again, this is where you're going to actually show content. And we have several different types. Your text view is where you're going to show labels, titles, and things like that. Edit views are where you're going to have the user enter in text. And image view, of course, are for showing images. And then buttons are for, saying save buttons and things like that. Switcher for like on-off switches. And then we have spinners, checkboxes, radio buttons, and then the newer ones is like the floating action buttons are usually at the bottom right. We have web views for showing web pages and stuff. If you write a web application, you can just have one web view and then go to different pages, so forth. And then we have progress bars that can either be what they call indeterminate, that's either spinning or a progress meter that goes across. And then seek bar is a similar version of a progress bar. So here's the image of our designer, and this is basically showing our floating action button at the bottom. We have a text view that says hello world in the middle, and then we have our toolbar at the top. And as you can see in the top right or left, there's all the different widgets that you can drag and drop onto the screen. And then on the bottom left here, you can click on them, and there's going to be a properties section on the right where you could set the different properties. Again, stop me if you guys have any questions. The manifest is a XML file that defines the app. When you create an app, one is created for you, which is nice, but this is where everything that makes up your app is defined. So it also sets where the permissions that are needed. So a lot of apps nowadays need certain permissions. Like if you want to access the user's context, you need to get permission from the user to access that. So you have to define the permissions, and then in your app, you have to ask the user for that permission before you can get that. The system will allow you to get those otherwise. Again, it defines the app and all the activities that are made up in that app. And it also defines any services that you have. So here's an example manifest. Again, this is an XML. We've got our internet permissions, which is like your most basic permission. if you're going to access the internet, you have to have that in there. You don't have to ask the user for permission for that, because that's a pretty basic permission. You just have to put that in your manifest, and then you can go onto the web or go get stuff from the internet. We're setting our application here, and then we just have one activity called main activity in here. And that, the main and launcher types are basically what specifies the main activity that's going to start up. So in building our app, Android uses Gradle, and it uses a build.gradle file. And they're not the best, but it does, it uses the groovy language, takes a little getting used to. But the nice thing about it when you build an app from Android Studio is a lot of these templates are built for you. So it'll be on there, and you can just add things to it. They're starting to go into Kotlin scripts, which are, instead of using the groovy language, it uses Kotlin, and it's a little bit easier to understand. So again, it describes how to build the app, and it describes any dependencies that are involved with that. So here's our top level Gradle file. I'm not going to go into too much details, but that's kind of what it looks like. How are we doing on time? I think we're doing pretty good. Yeah, sure.
How often do you mess with, how often do you modify your Gradle?
Not very often. So if you're just starting, usually the main thing that you'll be doing is adding libraries. Because one of the things you want to do is you don't want to reinvent a lot of stuff. There's a library called Retrofit, which is pretty famous for doing all your networking stuff. And that handles that for you. So you're going to want to use their library, and then you don't have to write that code. And that's one of the nice things about all these different libraries that are out there. They're almost all free, and you can just add them on there. So usually, this is the app level, and this is where you define your dependencies. So here you can see that we've defined our Kotlin standard library. And these are some of the different standard libraries that you would add to your app. So for resources, we have a bunch of different types. We have drawable, which is kind of all your images. You have layouts, which are your screens. We have menus, if you have menus in your different parts of your app. We have values, which are all your strings and different things like that. And we'll go into those in more detail. For drawables, they're almost all in XML. You can have different shapes, vectors, selectors, and then obviously PNGs and different types of regular images. Now, the problem with using like PNGs and JPEGs and stuff is it makes your app bigger. So the more big images you use, the bigger your app's going to be, and you want to try to, reduce that. So usually, if you have an artist that can draw you vector images, that's going to make your app a lot smaller. So here's an example of a shape. Here's a gradient shape. And this is defined in XML. You see on the left here, we've said we have a rectangle shape. It's got a gradient. We set our start colors and our end colors. And you can have different types. In this case, we have a linear gradient type. Here's an actual vector. And usually this is done by a drawing program, so you don't have to write all this stuff. It does it for you. But again, instead of some huge, large bitmap, this is a image that can be resized. So on every different phone that can be different size, it'll scale perfectly, and it's a very small file. Here's a shape. In this case, this is like a progress one. It's got a rotating progress spinner, and it's a little more complex, but it's nice because we defined in XML this rotating shape there. Now this is a selector where you can set something that's like selected or not selected, enabled, and you can have different images associated with that. So for your layouts, again, they're in XML. We usually start out with a view group at the top, and this is going to be your container. And then we put the views inside of it. You can also use special tags called merge and include to include other layouts inside there. That way you can share your layouts. And this is an example of my podcast player's layout. You can see that on the right is the actual screen, and then on the left is the XML. And XML is kind of nice if you need to like do, find and replace type things or do things around. You can also, in the editor, drag things around and so forth. So it makes it really nice. You see that we're using the constraint layout at the top, which is really nice for laying things out next to each other. Again, we have menus. It's built in XML. Starts with a menu tag and then uses items for individual items. Again, I tend to go a little fast, so if I'm going too fast, let me know. I'll try to slow down. So here's a sample menu item here. This is really nice if you have in your toolbar little menu items for different options and so forth. So values encompass a lot of different things. We can have colors in there. We can have dimensions, strings. And one of the nice things about Android is you can internationalize it. You can have it for different languages. And the way you do that is you start out with whatever your main language is. It doesn't have to be English, but if it's English, you'll just be in your strings, and then you would have like strings. You'd have a values-es for, say, Spanish and so forth, different folder values that would have the different translations in there. So this is kind of what a colors file looks like. You defined it in basically a hex value there, so it's just red, green, blue, and so forth, with maybe a alpha channel in the beginning. And you can name them whatever you want, different colors, whatever like your designer may give you. Dimensions are really nice they use something called a device independent pixel, or DP for short, and that's a scalable size so that if you're on different screens, whatever it is that you have dimensions set for, it will scale to that. And then again, with strings, this is how you define them. You give it a name and a string, and then in a translated file, it would be, say, the Spanish version and so forth. So it holds, again, it can have any name. And then here's an example of a values.es directory for Spanish. And then you can also have string arrays. This is the translation editor in here. This is if you wanted to do it by hand. You could put in different language slots, and you can put French, Spanish, whatever languages you have. There's also places out there that will do the translation for you. You send them your English file, and you tell them I want it in Spanish and French or whatever, and they'll translate it for you. So it makes it really nice. Styles are really nice. A lot of times designers like to say, I want all my text to be with this font, this size. I want it to be bold, different things like that. It can also style your different widgets. So you could have a custom text view for all your app. It's a real nice way of doing that. And again, like here we have the settings title here. This is where we're saying we want the text size to be 24, the color to be a hollow blue bright. That just happened to be the name I called it. So different things we can do. So I'm going to try to do a demo here. And I'll show you Android Studio. This is what it looks like when you start Android Studio. And what we'll do is all you have to do is say, I want to start a new Android Studio project. And in this case, we're going to choose a basic activity. And you can see there's a lot of different things you can do here. You can have a basic, an empty. You can have one with a bottom navigation activity. You can have a fragment with a view model, either full screen, a master detail, or one with a navigation drawer activity. And the nice thing about this is it will create all the startup files for you. So you just have to choose what you like. You can also build for Wear OS, Android TV, Android Auto, or Android things. If you're into IoT, they have Android things as well. So in this case, we're just going to create a basic activity. We're going to give it a name, say sample 3. We've got already our package name chosen, where we're going to put it, and we're going to use Kotlin as our language. And then we're just going to click Finish. And one of the nice things about it, it builds the project for you, creates all the directories, creates our screen for us. I mean, all this work has been done for you, so it's really nice. So what we're going to do is we're just going to click Run. And what this is going to do is it's going to start the emulator. And as you can see, this emulator comes up pretty fast, and it's going to rebuild it, and you'll see your app on the screen. In this case, it's sample 3. You got our hello world on there, and then our button down here. And then you can click on it, and you can see that we've got a little toast at the bottom there. So it's really simple to get started. I definitely recommend that you take a look at some of the websites that are out there. There's the developer.android.com, which is a great learning place. There's Udemy, I think it is. There's a lot of different places to, Udacity, right? Yeah, thank you. Where you can learn. It's a really great thing to do. It's really fun. One of the things I've done is, like, whenever I have a need for something, I just write an app for it. So I wanted to keep track of my TV programs that I watch, so I wrote a little app that does that, just little fun things to do. So there's all kinds of things you can do, and it's fun to really get started in learning. I know I went through this really quickly, so if you guys have any questions, feel free. Again, it's really easy to get started with Android.
Could you tell me or explain a little bit more about the constraint layout versus
Sure.
the older?
Sure. So let me show you, let's go into this activity main here. See if we can get this a little bit bigger. So this is the layout. If you switch, see down here at the bottom here, we have a design and a text. This shows you the actually this is a coordinator. Let me see if this one has it. Yeah, this one has a constraint layout. And what you see here is this constraint bottom to bottom of parent. So that's saying I want this guy to be constrained to the bottom, and if you do it to the top at the same time, it centers it. But if let's say that we wanted to add another item, say we added another or a button here, we just drag it on here. We can then take this guy and connect it to this guy so that it's right next to it. And then we could take this button and say, well, we want this guy to be over here. And then what you could do here is you can take this guy and say, well, I really want this to go, well, it's probably going to stick over there since we said I want it to be the right of it. And as you look at our XML, you see our button is end to end of parent. So we've connected it to the right. Now this one is set up to be the end to the start of button. So this is kind of how you connect the different pieces together. And there's a lot of really nice things you can do with that. You can, make sure that they have barriers and all kinds of neat things to say, well, you got to stop right here. I only want it to go to say a third of the way through or halfway through. It'll stop on the edge there. So it's a real nice way of lining things up.
So it's more flexible than just a relative layout?
Yeah.
You've got more options?
Yeah, there's a lot of little things you can do with it. And of course, the big thing for me is what I try to do is when a designer gives me the designs, I want it to match what they've got. And this is a really nice tool for doing that. Because I'll tell you, I'm not an artist. I let the professionals do that part, I mean, sometimes I'll come up with my own UIs, and they're not the best. So I like working with good designers and stuff for that. So, any other questions?
So what if you develop something on your own, how could you give it to your family or something? How do you share?
So there's a couple ways to do it. It's pretty easy to create a Google account, developer account, and you can actually publish it and just tell them about it. And the problem with the Play Store now is there's so many apps out there that probably no one's going to find it unless they know about it or unless it's advertised. So you could do it that way, or you could just install it onto their phones. That's one way of doing it. You can put a developer thing on there. It's kind of interesting because you could actually put that, what they call an APK, which is what the app is, put it up someplace and someone can just install it onto their phone so pretty easily. And you can have things like beta versions as well, stuff like that, and put people on the list. Any other questions?
Can you talk a little bit more about the Kotlin, like the advantages and disadvantages versus?
Sure. So as you may have noticed, all this was written in Kotlin. So here you basically define a class by just saying class, and then the app compat activity is basically what you're going to subclass. And one of the nice things about it is there's no semicolons, which Java has. It's a little thing, but it's kind of nice not having to do that. It has things called lambdas. You see here the set on click listener. Instead of putting parentheses and some complicated code, we know that if you look at the set on click listener, you can command click in here, and you'll see that, let's see if I can find it. Where was it? Oh, right here. So this guy is actually an interface that you have to implement that's on click, this on click method. But with lambdas, you don't have to do that. It knows that it's going to have a view, and then you can just do your code there. So it's a lot cleaner, a lot simpler, a lot easier to read. And the more you get into it, it's like you can do a lot. Actually, you probably can't even see that very well, I imagine. Is that a little bit better? Sorry. I was just realizing it's pretty tiny. So.
Is it typed like Java?
It's similar. Yeah, I mean, it basically gets compiled into Java bytecode once it's done. So they're compatible. They can work together. So, in fact, you could intermix. You could have Java files as well as Kotlin together and stuff. So, yeah. And, like if you have older Java libraries, you can use it in your Kotlin code too. So, yeah. Yeah, it's very interchangeable. It's basically built on top of Java. So, but it's definitely a lot easier to use.
So I noticed when you created this project that it was in 16. Is that usually where you start?
So that's a good question. One of the things that, so if we were to go, say, new project, let's go back to that screen again. Actually, get out of presentation mode. Let's go to new project. So one of the things that they do is they tell you that your app will run on 99.6% of devices. I personally, I will go to probably 22 because it makes it your job easier. If you have to support all those lower ends, there's not that many, to be honest with you. This one supports 80% of the devices out there. It just makes it so much easier to develop on that. So I would definitely recommend 22 and above. Obviously, the higher up you go, the less people you're going to be able to reach. So. And again, it's a really fun language. It's a fun operating system. One of the nice things about Android is you can pretty much do whatever you want. If you have the imagination to do it, you could create it. Android is very open as to what you can do. Obviously they want to prevent viruses and things like that in there, but there's so many things you can do that you wouldn't be able to do in other platforms.
So what's the process of getting something on the Play Store?
So again, you have to sign up for a developer account. It's pretty easy. You just have to go to their Play console. You have to, there's a few things that are kind of a pain. You have to give it a description. You have to give them some screenshots. You upload it, and they have a lot of automated scans, and so almost, a lot of times it can be like, you know, a few hours before your app's out there. But I have heard some stories that it's going to take longer, that especially for new apps, they might scrutinize it a little bit more just to make sure there's nothing bad in them, you know, because they've had some problems. So, but it's pretty easy. It's really nice for us if you have an established app out there and like you need a real quick bug fix, you can have something out in a few hours and stuff. So it's really nice.
Can you drop the links to your courses?
Sure. Let me go back here. Here's actually some links to some development stuff. So developer.android.com and kotlinlang.org is where you can learn all about Kotlin. And then one of the things that I've done is I sign up for these newsletters. One of them is androidweekly.net. You can sign up, and that'll send you every week a newsletter that has a whole bunch of articles. Like they kind of scour the web for like the best articles of the week, and it's a really nice place for that. So let me see. If you go to LinkedIn Learning, you could just search for my stuff here. See if I can find here. Of course, I'll probably have to sign in here. So you can just, once you've got an account, you can search for different things. And so I've got the Learning Kotlin for Android Development and then Android Development Audio and Video up there. So there's a class. I would say if you're going to do it, do the Learning Kotlin for Android Development because they're going to be taking that off pretty soon. It's gotten a little old, and so they're retiring it. So, and then the if anyone's familiar with raywinderlich.com, let's go back here. It started out as a iOS site, but now they do Android and Flutter development. So that's a really good resource as well. I actually have an article coming out on Monday for Flutter. So I'm doing some Flutter work as well. So definitely a good place to go.
How do you like Flutter?
Well, to be honest with you, I was very skeptical about Flutter. I was like, you know, so many companies try to do this cross-platform thing, and I thought, well, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it would be good. But the more I use it, the more I like it. It's definitely a different, it comes from the web, so that's more of a React style set of coding. So if you're familiar with the web, you might be more familiar with that. It's all based off of these widgets that get, basically when anything changes, it just redraws the widget. But it's very fast. And it's got something called hot reload. So you make a change in your file, and you just say save, and it's like almost instant. It's up there. So it's really fast development. So it's really nice. So again, this is a lot of different resources for Android, iOS, and Flutter. All right. Anything else? Yes?
Where's your article coming out for Flutter?
It's coming out on the raywinderlich.com. Yeah, so it should be out on Monday. So I think they have, we have the Android sale right coming out, and then we've got different Flutter articles on here as well. So. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate y'all coming. Thanks.